morning. You're very welcome to this webinar, Beyond GDP, Governance and Budgeting for Wellbeing. My name is Caroline Whyte. I have a background in ecological economics and I help with research and communications for Feasta, the Foundation for the Economics of Sustainability. This webinar is being co-organised by Feasta with the Cork Environmental Forum. I'm just going to quickly explain a few practicalities and briefly provide a little bit of context for the webinar, and then I'll be passing the screen on to Professor John Sweeney, who's going to be our moderator today. So, Professor Sweeney is going to be introducing our speakers, and they'll each give a very quick introduction themselves, and then we're going to hear their presentations. Each presentation is about 15 to 20 minutes long, and during all that time, of course, you can keep sending in questions if you'd like. There'll be a 5 to 10 minute break just after noon, and then there'll be a session for the panelists to answer their questions, and there'll be a roundtable discussion, and then finally there'll be a summing up and closure by James O'Donovan, chairperson of the Cork Environmental Forum. So our principal aim for today's event is that it be a catalyst for the establishment of a more well-being oriented governance and budgeting process in Ireland and elsewhere. So if you've registered for this, you're probably already aware that over the past 6 or 7 decades, there's been a tendency, both in policy making and in media discourse as well, to assume that GDP growth equals improved societal well-being. When growth goes up, it's generally taken to mean that a country's doing well. And you probably also know that there's some big problems with that assumption. As Robert F. Kennedy put it in a famous speech in 1968, our gross national product is $800 billion a year, but that gross national product counts air pollution and cigarette advertising and ambulances to clear our highways of carnage. It counts special locks for our doors and the jails for the people who break them. It counts the destruction of the redwood and the loss of our natural wonder in chaotic sprawl. It counts Whitman's rifle and Speck's knife and the television programs which glorify violence in order to sell toys to our children. Yet, the gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate or the integrity of our public officials. It measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. Of course, some things just can't be measured, or for that matter, priced. There are some things on Kennedy's list that it's just impossible to apply a definitive quantitative value to, such as the joy of children's play. And strong arguments have also been made against claims that the environment's value can accurately be expressed in purely quantitative terms. We all need to acknowledge, of course, that you can't measure everything. However, that doesn't mean that we should abandon any attempt to get beyond GDP in trying to measure well-being. Quantifying well-being really, ideally, should be a little bit like doing calculus. It's an approximation or a set of guidelines that can never be completely accurate, but that's invaluable in ensuring that at least we're going in the right direction. And it's clear that certain metrics can do a far, far better job of taking us in the right direction than GDP does. So this morning's webinar has its roots in a 1992 book that was written by Feasta's late co-founder, the economist Richard Douthwaite, called The Growth Illusion. The Growth Illusion was translated into German by a professor at the Feast Institute for Interdisciplinary Research in Heidelberg, Hans Diefenbacher. With a team of colleagues, Professor Diefenbacher then went on to develop a national welfare index as an alternative to GDP, which has been implemented in a number of German states. And today we're delighted to welcome one of his colleagues, Dr. Benjamin Held, as a speaker at this webinar. In recent years, interest in the vital topic of measuring well-being has burgeoned elsewhere too, and increasing numbers of countries around the world are attempting to take well-being into account in their governance and budgeting decisions. New Zealand, Scotland, Wales and Iceland have formed a well-being alliance together, for example. So we're very pleased to welcome Wales's Chief Statistician, Glyn Jones, who will be describing how the Welsh Government has established governance for well-being from national to local government based on the foundation of their visionary Wellbeing for Future Generations Act. And finally, we're delighted to welcome Sinead Bracken from the Central Statistics Office in Ireland. In 2018, the Central Statistics Office published Ireland's first Wellbeing of the Nation report, which presents a snapshot of the country's wellbeing through a dashboard of wellbeing indicators. Some of the groundwork for this webinar was laid by an Irish Wellbeing Indicators group, which seeks to promote the development of a wellbeing index in Ireland, and which has worked closely over the past few years with the Feasta group in Heidelberg. The Irish group's members are Sean O'Conloyne and Willie Keefill of Feasta, and Professor John Sweeney of Antashka. Professor Sweeney, as many of you probably know already, is a distinguished and internationally recognised climate scientist and a regular contributor to print and broadcast media on matters related to climate change, science and policy. We're delighted to have him as the moderator for our webinar. I'm very excited that this webinar is happening, and appropriately, it's World Environment Day today. So on behalf of Feasta and the Cork Environmental Forum, I'd like to convey our sincere thanks to all of the presenters. And now over to Professor John Sweeney.
Okay, well, let me begin then. And what I would like to say at the outset is, of course, that this is a critically important topic we're looking at today, and it's a very opportune time for us to be looking at it as well. I'm reminded of the opening lines in the famous novel A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, where he says, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, it was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. And in a sense, that encapsulates the problem that we have today, which is a problem that materially, yes, our wealth is growing. We have a lot more possessions and a lot more security in many ways than our forefathers. But we are also facing issues in terms of our foolishness. And we know that we're challenging planetary boundaries, for example, which makes the next generation and the generation after it rather less sustainable than perhaps we thought they might be, and certainly that we were as well. And part of the logic of today is to question the way in which we measure progress. I think it's very opportune because, of course, we've been in lockdown for almost 3 months now, and we've seen how society has begun to revise its value system, begun to revise the things that it prioritizes, begun to adapt to what I think we're increasingly going to call the new normal. And the new normal will be something that's really very different from what we've had before. So it's very good that we have 3 very key speakers today to talk to us about various different dimensions of that. And I'm very pleased to start that ball rolling by asking them to give us a very brief introduction to what we're going to do. So to begin with, we have Professor Glyn Jones, who is going to talk to us about the way in which we have managed to get, in Wales at least, questions of well-being embedded, enshrined in legislation, a very important step. And I'm going to pass you over to Glyn now to try and take us through some of the ways in which he has managed to do that as the Chief Statistician of the Welsh Government. Over to you, Glyn.
Thank you very much, John and Caroline, for the introductions, and I hope you can hear me okay. Unfortunately, I'm the one in the room who's been having technical problems as a speaker, so I'm sure my colleagues will shout if there are any issues. I also thank you, John, for giving me a title, which I have not.
Sorry,
that's okay. It's always nice. I quite often get called doctor or professor, and I have definitely not earned those titles. So, as John explained, I'm Chief Statistician in Welsh Government. I've had this role for many years, and as with others, I'm sure you'll understand that is an important role in presenting to the nation the key statistics and evidence that inform decisions and making that information available. And I've been honoured to be really integral in terms of the work on the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act in Wales, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on. The Wellbeing of Future Generations Act in Wales was a truly groundbreaking piece of legislation which was passed in 2015. It requires public bodies in Wales to think about the long-term impact of their decisions, to work better with people, communities and each other, and to prevent persistent problems such as poverty, health inequalities and climate change. So very much in line with the comments that have been made so far, with the intention to make a long-lasting and positive change to current and future generations. It's really intended to have a fundamental change on how public bodies are working and working with other sectors such as private sector and third sector to do things in a truly transformative way to support future generations in Wales. There's a continued commitment for the government and ministers in Wales for this agenda. This is most recently highlighted, as Caroline mentioned, that we've recently joined the Wellbeing Economy Governance Network with Scotland, Iceland and New Zealand. And I think that highlights our continued commitment to looking at things differently. But an important part of the building blocks of this legislation, which I'll talk about, is measurement and reporting. We've always been keen to look beyond GDP to measure the progress towards the wide-ranging goals, which I'll talk about a little bit later. The report puts on a statutory, the Act puts on a statutory basis the requirements for sets of national indicators and annual reporting, and also the setting of national milestones for those indicators. And I'll talk through that in my talk in a few minutes' time. Part of this is engaging with a wide range of stakeholders and communities, and that's at the heart of what Welsh Government does to make sure that we're measuring the right things, from the natural environment to people's health to measures of equality, whilst not ignoring those important measures of prosperity as well. So it has really put statisticians at the heart of the policy making process, given me as Chief Statistician a unique role in reporting annually on our progress as a nation, which wasn't there before this Act. So I'll talk about this today. I'll give some thoughts on what I think has gone well, where the challenges are still to come, and I'll also give some reflections on the pandemic and what might this mean from a policy perspective, as well as our measurement approach. So I look forward to talk to you again in a few minutes' time.
Thank you very much, Glyn. Apologies for promoting you there, but and also apologies for giving people a snippet of the exciting things to come in your paper. Glyn is talking about legislation and the success of legislation in Wales, and of course a central theme of our webinar today is how do we get the ideas that we have today embedded in the political and the legal system, and in particular, how do we overcome the entrenched economic paradigm which dominates things so much in this area? I'm delighted therefore now to introduce Benjamin Held. Dr. Held has been working with Hans Diefenbach in Heidelberg for many years now, and he has developed there with Professor Diefenbach a composite index of well-being which has gained traction throughout Germany. It's one which, as you'll see, embeds a lot of economic paradigms, a lot of economic ideals into the system, and a way of getting through, therefore, to decision makers. So I'll pass you over to Benjamin to introduce that to you, and of course he'll deal with it in a little more detail later on this morning.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you very much, all of you, for the possibility to talk here today. My main perspective for the webinar today is that I think that it's important to have an aggregate headline indicator which can compete with GDP, and by doing so is able to debunk GDP as the most commonly used progress indicator today. Such a headline indicator must present highly aggregated information, and because of that will certainly have many problems of its own. I nevertheless think that it's important to have such an indicator, because politicians and the public need such an information tool, because the message of indicator systems is often very hard to communicate and leaves much, sometimes too much room for interpretation. If there is no such alternative headline indicator, I think there is a good chance that GDP will continue to be the most important indicator concerning societal progress, and that would be a big problem, in my opinion. As a possible option for an alternative headline indicator, which concentrates on economic welfare, I will present the National Welfare Index, which John already mentioned, which we developed for Germany and for whom we already created a feasibility study for Ireland in cooperation with Feasta and Maynooth University in 2017. I'm looking forward also for the other presentations concerning the measurement of well-being in Wales and Ireland, and of course to the questions and input from the audience.
Okay, thank you very much, Benjamin. We look forward to that. So we have the legal, we have the economic, and now one of the most interesting things that has developed in recent years within Ireland has been the development of an environmental indicators annual report from our own Central Statistical Office. And Sinead Bracken is here as a health statistician to describe to us how the CSO have selected the well-being indicators and a broad range of indicators from the environmental annual report that might help us along the way in terms of showing us the direction Ireland is going. The Celtic Tiger was one phase of our development, and maybe it didn't develop in the well-being way, the way that people thought it would. And as we emerge from COVID, of course, there is also concern that we don't want to go back to the bad old ways as well. So I think it's crucial that we get within Ireland some learning experiences from our other speakers today that we can apply within this country as well. So Sinead, I'll hand you over to whet the appetite for our viewers and listeners today.
Perfect. Thank you, John. So my name is Sinead Bracken, and I'm here from the Central Statistics Office. I'm a health statistician, I must admit, so I'm not an environmental expert, but I'm here today to speak about three main topics. So I'll speak about the Wellbeing of the Nation report. I'll also speak about the Environmental Indicators report that John spoke about. I'm presenting this on behalf of my colleague Raymond McKeever. And lastly, then I'll discuss the Sustainable Development Goals in the context of the Central Statistics Office. So just to give some background on these topics, the Wellbeing of the Nation report was compiled in 2018, and it looks at various wellbeing indicators. So I'll speak about how the report came together and the next steps of this project. I'll follow this with an overview of the Environmental Indicators report. And this annual report looks at various environmental indicators such as greenhouse gas emissions. And lastly, then I'll touch on Sustainable Development Goals, for which CSO has a role of sourcing and managing the data and also presenting the corresponding outputs. So I'm very excited to speak about these today, and thank you again for having me.
Thank you very much, Sinead. Well, I don't think we'll waste any more time. I think we'll get into the nitty-gritty of our presentations this morning. So we'll start actually with Benjamin, who has I think, control over his own PowerPoint slides there, and I'll leave him to talk to you then about how the Foundation for the Economics of Sustainability, Feasta, has been working with his group in FEST on the development of what has been a very successful well-being index, which has now, as I said, begun to be adopted by regions within Germany and even countries beyond. So I'll pass you over to Benjamin to describe that.
So at the Institute for Interdisciplinary Research in Heidelberg, we have a long tradition concerning the measurement of sustainable development, on the one hand with indicator systems and on the other hand with aggregated indices like the National Welfare Index, or NWI in short, which I would like to present to you today. So on this slide, you can see an overview of the following presentation. First, I want to give you an introduction to the concept of MWI, then a short overview concerning its calculation principles and components, then show you the results for Germany, then the results of the feasibility study for Ireland in really short terms, and then conclude with some insight concerning the potential uses and the political impact of NWI. So let's start with the concept. The NWI is an aggregate indicator of welfare that goes beyond the perspective of GDP. It aims to capture consequences of economic activities on current welfare and partly on future generations. Therefore, the NWI integrates a range of environmental, social, and economic aspects that either contribute to the economic well-being of society or are detrimental to it. In the context of a social and ecological transformation, the index and its components could be part of an information system monitoring changes in different dimensions with a focus on the impact on the development of overall welfare. You may thus think of it as a potential headline indicator that provides an alternative view on the development of society, in particular in comparison to GDP over time. In fact, the deficiencies of GDP as the dominant progress indicator were a major starting point for the design of NWI, as John has already mentioned. The National Welfare Index was first presented in 2009 as the result of a research project supported by the German Environment Agency and the Environmental Ministry, partly as a reaction to the indicators of the National Sustainability Strategy, which prominently featured GDP. Since then, we have launched a revised version in 2012 and developed a regional adaptation, the Regional Welfare Index, that has been calculated for 7 German states called Länder up to now. The regional calculations were funded by regional political actors and institutions, including several ministries. So there is a certain political interest in the indicator. During the last years, we were able to calculate and publish an updated time series for Germany every year, which makes the NWI the only alternative aggregate welfare measure regularly published in Germany. The index is also included in the compendium Data on the Environment of the German Environment Agency. Yet it is still work in progress. Currently, we are working on further methodological improvements, especially with regard to the environmental components. So let's have a quick look on the general methodological approach. Here is a list of the items included in NWI, just to give you a first idea. Altogether, the NWI is composed of 20 components, which are, with one exception, accounted for in monetary terms. So we consider environmental damage costs, not environmental pressures or damages in physical units. The components in the list colored in green positively contribute to welfare. This, for example, includes inequality-weighted private consumption, but also the value of household work. The components in the list colored in orange are social and environmental costs that reduce welfare. They include the costs of commuting and of traffic accidents, for example, as well as environmental damage costs with regard to water, soil, air pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, or loss of ecosystems. We also account for replacement costs for the depletion of non-renewable resources and the cost of using nuclear energy. These costs are subtracted from the sum of positive welfare contributions. So thus the calculation principle is resumed quite simply. However, the methodology behind the components is not that simple. So the basic component is private consumption, following the traditional assumption that the consumption of goods and services creates benefit to individuals and contributes to welfare. However, a high overall level of consumption in a society does not signify a high welfare level if distribution is very unequal. Therefore, private consumption is weighted with an index of income distribution. If income inequality rises, this translates into diminishing weighted consumption, if all other things being equal. To weighted consumption, we add the welfare-creating components, especially some important ones not included in GDP, namely the value of household work and family work, as well as voluntary work. Finally, welfare-reducing consequences of economic activities in the social and environmental sphere are considered and subtracted as costs to society. Of course, if those costs are reduced, this will translate into a positive contribution to overall welfare development in the NWI. Quantification and monetization of many of the components are not trivial, of course. Monetization in particular is always related to difficult methodological choices. There also is considerable uncertainty and a lack of data for some aspects. We generally try to make use of the best available knowledge and to be conservative in our estimates, thus avoiding any overestimation of impacts. As a consequence, however, the extent of certain costs is still underestimated. Due to the remaining challenges with respect to data availability and methodology, we still consider the National Welfare Index work in progress. However, for many components, we can already draw on data from official statistics or other sufficiently reliable sources, be it private consumption, public expenditure, or emission data. So let's have a quick look at the results for Germany. I don't can and want to go into detail here because of the time, but we can see some interesting, results there if we only took a quick look at it. When added up, the 20 components of the NWI for Germany show quite interesting empirical results in comparison to GDP, with trends that are overall stable to adjustments of the database or calculation methods so far. The graph displays the NWI for Germany compared to the German GDP from 1991 to 2017. GDP and NWI are both normalized at a level of 100 for the year of 2000 in order to make their developments more easily comparable. Over the whole period of 26 years, both indicators draw quite different pictures of welfare development because, as I said, with the limited time, I will really go roughly into the details here. You can see 4 phases here. And in some of the phases, you can see that GDP and NWI did not develop so differently, like in phase 1 and phase 4. But there are also clear differences in phase 3 and 2. Important causes for those differences are the changes in income inequality, which has risen in Germany in phase 2 quite considerably, and the cost of environmental damages, which decreased in phase 1 quite strongly and was therefore a main reason for the increase of NWI in this period, but in phase 3 stayed nearly constant. So the broader picture clearly shows that GDP and a multidimensional measure of welfare development like NWI give different impressions of the progress of society. Overall, from 1991 to 2017, GDP increased by 38 points and indicated a relatively constant societal progress, whereas NWI only increased overall by 7 points and showed varying phases of improvement, stagnation, and deterioration. So economic growth can go along with stagnating or decreasing welfare, maybe even vice versa. So also a quick look to the results from the feasibility study for Ireland. In collaboration with Willie Kiefel and Sean O'Conlon from Feasta and John Sweeney from Maynooth University, we published a feasibility study regarding the calculation of the National Welfare Index for Ireland in 2017. You can see the results on the slide. Also, I cannot go into detail here and probably shouldn't go into detail because the data is quite old right now. And but even now you can see some interesting differences between GDP and NWI in Ireland, which are to a good extent caused by changes of income inequality, but also by other components like the rising costs due to the consumption of non-renewable energy resources, and the overall fact that GDP growth is only partly linked to rising consumption expenditures. So the main message of the feasibility study is that the calculation of the NWI for Ireland is possible and can have interesting results, but we would need to put some more work and resources in it to get better and more data, to get better and reliable and more up-to-date results there. So finally, I would like to share some thoughts about potential uses of the NWI and some experiences from our work in Germany until now. So first to the potential uses. So in what ways could the information of NWI be used to reorient society? First, as I already said, NWI is an indicator debunking GDP as the most widely used indicator of progress in a society. It presents highly aggregated information while remaining comparatively close to traditional national accounting and within a domestic perspective. Its progression can therefore be compared with the development of GDP. Raising awareness to the divergence between a focus on market production and a more comprehensive definition of welfare, which includes both additional welfare enhancing aspects as well as neglected costs. Thus, it questions the paradigm of economic growth and points to other sources of welfare. NWI is also a monitoring instrument. The presentation as one comprehensive index is meant to address a broader public rather than a detailed set of indicators suited for the use by experts. This, of course, necessarily comes at the cost of less insight into trends in individual issue areas. At the same time, it is relatively easy to decompose the index into its components and the underlying physical and economic data to track developments in more detail. The NWI also contributes to the debate about what has to be included in our definition of a positive development of society, helping to reorient society and politics away from growth to more multifaceted goals such as a resource efficient, greenhouse gas neutral and fair society. One index certainly cannot encompass all related issues, but it may help to open a door to a better informed public discussion and a new narrative of welfare and well-being instead of economic growth. However, the NWI is neither able nor supposed to supplant other additional information systems necessary for discussion and decision making. There is no one big solution to all questions of societal reporting, especially many aspects of well-being cannot be included into the NWI because they cannot be monetized. So finally, what about the political impact? Has NWI a tangible impact on politics in Germany? Well, the answer is maybe yes. Maybe a little, but to be honest, it is really still too early to answer the questions. NWI is very probably the best known alternative welfare indicator in Germany. But of course, the whole issue of alternative indicators is still mostly one for specialists in Germany. So far, NWI is the only index that is presented and updated on a regular basis. The fact itself that the NWI is published regularly and that 7 Länder have regional welfare index calculations has led to some public attention and to a certain recognition. Until now, policymakers who funded the calculation thus mostly use it to engage in public discussions about alternative welfare measures. But the work also starts to bring together people from different governmental departments who discuss what should be included and how. So to conclude, NWI alone will of course not be sufficient to monitor the social ecological transformation we want and need. A single aggregate measure can never provide all the information required to monitor complex societal processes and support their governance. There are also long-standing and legitimate discussions about the uses and pitfalls of aggregating different dimensions of welfare, about specific methodologies and monetization in general. More comprehensive as well as specific information systems are necessary, and quite a lot already exist, like the ones we will hear from Glyn and Sinead in the next presentations. Yet we think that NWI as an aggregate measure of welfare and the information comprised in its individual components can be one element in societal reporting that supports developments leading to transformation. And with that, thank you for your attention. I'm looking forward for the next presentations.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. That's a fascinating story that we've heard there. And of course, one of the problems of debunking GDP has always been the issue of how do you get over the subjective alternatives that it introduces. And what Benjamin has been describing is as an objective criteria of monetization of variables, which I think gets through to politicians perhaps who are more attuned to the economics paradigm than to the social paradigm. So it's a very valuable, complicated story, but some fascinating outcomes from those graphs if you think about them in terms of how society has been evolving. So let's move on to see how Ireland has been doing in that sense, because we're at a very much earlier stage than the German experience there. And I'm going to pass you over now to Sinead Bracken, who's going to talk a little about the Environmental Indicators Report and how the range of indicators that are useful to put Ireland on the road towards debunking GDP, which we know in Ireland anyway doesn't need too much debunking because it's awful. We have complicated stories due to multinational transfers and so on. So we need something that's better than GDP, but we need something that's much more attuned to what social changes we're making and how sustainable those are. Thank you very much, and I'll pass you over to Sinead. And keep your questions coming in, of course, to the Q&A box on the right-hand side, and we'll try and get to them later on. Sinead.
Perfect. Thanks, John. Thanks for that introduction as well. I'll just share my presentation. One moment. So as you were saying, John, my name is Sinead Bracken and I work in the health section of the Central Statistics Office. So today I'll be detailing the work of the CSO relating to wellbeing, and this involves discussing the Wellbeing of the Nation report, the Environmental Indicators report, and also the Sustainable Development Goals in the context of the CSO. So just to begin, what is wellbeing? The National Economic and Social Council's document, The Developmental Welfare State, states, in a globalised world, the strength of Ireland's economy and of its society will rest on the same foundation, the human qualities of the people who participate in them. This view feeds into well-being, which can be said to measure how people feel about their lives as a whole. Well-being in its broadest sense can be viewed as a measure of all aspects of life. As a result, it is a complex, multidimensional issue influenced by factors such as the state of the environment, the education levels of the population, economic performance, public safety, and the health of the population, among other indicators. So why is well-being important? So there are several reasons that well-being is important. Just a few here would be political focus or public activity. And just to zone in on again, GDP, it has long been used as a measure of the population's well-being. However, GDP does not measure well-being. It does not capture the economic well-being provided by goods and services households produce for themselves. GDP, it measures income, but not its distribution. GDP does not measure wealth, financial or otherwise, which have an impact on an individual's well-being. And this is just, I suppose, backed up by this document here as well. So just to move on to the dashboard project. So for the first step of the Wellbeing of the Nation report, research was done on well-being. So this was, I suppose, documents such as the Canadian Index of Wellbeing were consulted, documents such as the UK's ONS measuring National Wellbeing Report was consulted, Australia's Measures of Australia's projects was consulted, among others also. So these gave a general idea of, I suppose, what is well-being, what are other countries doing, and this gave us a basis. So from this, a list of 600 indicators was compiled. So step 2 then involved exploring the data on StatBank. So StatBank is CSO's statistical database, which stores all published CSO tabular outputs. This database was explored for possible well-being indicators, and a list of relevant indicators was compiled. And then the next step, which was step 3, which was a consultation with SMEs or subject matter experts. So subject matter experts were consulted for their thoughts on the list of indicators, and the list was then reduced to approximately 100 indicators. The subject matter experts included members of the Whittaker Institute of NUIG, the National Economic and Social Council, and the Department of Health. Indicators were then divided into various domains. So some of these we can see on the screen here, such as economy, work, education, time use and public safety, governance and equality, housing and natural environment, and health. And each domain has a number of indicators. So these are some key results from the Wellbeing of the Nation report in 2017. So just to zone in on something that may have a negative impact on well-being, we can see that the number of homeless people increased by 81% between 2011 and 2016. And then to zone in on something that would have, I suppose, a positive impact would be the number of healthy life years. So these increased from 66.9 to 67.3 in 2015. So the Wellbeing of the Nation report, it's a static document. It's available on the CSO's website. And it was thought to actually, I suppose, reiterate this in a report format. However, looking at other countries and looking at how they displayed their wellbeing data, it was actually suggested to do a dashboard. So why a wellbeing dashboard? So there's a need for a wellbeing dashboard. I suppose just to reiterate there what I have said about maybe a static document doesn't quite capture wellbeing. A dashboard would be much more appropriate. Wellbeing, it's a dynamic concept, so this would be much better captured in a dashboard. And I suppose the indicators, whether they're updated daily or weekly or yearly, a dashboard would be constantly able to update, whereas a report would be waiting for the new data to come out, or it would only be maybe released once a year or twice a year, and that the data by the time the report was released might be out of date. This would also be a much more user-friendly format. So a user could decide that they want to look at one particular indicator, and this would be much easier to find on a dashboard rather than, I suppose, scrolling through a report to try and find the indicator that's of interest to them. And this dashboard will keep the 8 domains for the main sections, and then within each of the domains there will be the number of indicators. So if we look at economy there, the domain economy, within that there will be average debt per household, consumer price index, modified GNI, average total annual earnings. And these are just some references here which may be of interest to look at afterwards. So prior to COVID-19, the CSO was actually also asked to partake in a process led by the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform to design a wellbeing framework for Ireland, but due to the current climate, unfortunately, this project is actually on hold. So that concludes the first section of my presentation. The second section of my presentation, I'll take a look at the environmental indicators, which John had discussed earlier. So I'm actually presenting this section on behalf of my colleague Raymond McKeever. Just to begin with some background, the National Statistics Board Strategy for Statistics from 2019 to 2014 recommended that the CSO develop a set of indicators showing Ireland's environmental performance in order to support evidence-based policymaking. The first environmental indicators report was published in 2014, initially on a biennial basis. However, it's now published annually. There were 65 indicators covering 10 domains in the 2019 publication, and the decision to adopt these indicators was made after consultation with stakeholders and a review of the practices adopted by other national statistical institutes. So choosing indicators. Many of the indicators are presented in a time series format for Ireland, while the international context is shown by comparing Ireland with other EU rates and world regions. These indicators will provide insight on the quality of life and well-being in Ireland. So just to look at the chapter structure, there were 65 indicators covering 10 domains in the 2019 report. So just to look at some domains here: global context, air, land use, energy, waste and biodiversity, among others. So Raymond has picked out a couple of indicators to look at in particular. So there will be 15 indicators discussed. Indicator 1, the world population from 1950 to 2018. The world's population increased by 201% from 2.5 billion in 1950 to 7.6 billion in 2018. The share of global population accounted for by Africa increased from 9% to 17% over this period, while that of Europe fell from 22% to 10%. Asia was the most populous region with 60% of the world's population in 2018. Life expectancy. Global life expectancy at birth increased from 47 years in the early 1950s to 70.9 years in 2015. Africa had the lowest life expectancy in 2015 at 60.3 years, while North America had the highest at 79.2 years. World mean temperature deviation. The indicator shows 3 series measuring global mean near surface temperature deviations for the 1850 to 2017 period. All 3 time series show an overall increase in temperatures compared with pre-industrial times. 2017 was one of the 3 warmest years on record, with temperatures between 0.99 degrees Celsius and 1.2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. World greenhouse gas emissions. This indicator shows greenhouse gas emissions for the most significant countries and regions specified in Annex 1 of the 1992 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change between 1990 and 2017. EU emissions fell by 20% from an average annual 5.4 billion tonnes of CO2 equivalent in 1990 to 1994 to 4.3 billion tonnes in 2017. Russian emissions of greenhouse gases fell by 19% over the same period, while emissions from the USA remained stable at 6.5 billion tonnes. EU environmental tax revenue. Environmental taxes accounted for 7.9% of Ireland's total tax revenues in 2017. This was the joint 11th highest percentage in the EU and above the EU average of 6.1%. Latvia had the highest environmental tax share of the total tax revenue in 2017 at 11.2%, while Luxembourg had the lowest share at 4.4%. EU nitrogen oxide emissions. Air quality in Ireland has improved since 1990 for all indicators except ammonia, but Ireland performed poorly compared with other EU member states in 2017. In 2017, 4 EU member states were above their 2010 national emission ceiling for nitrogen oxides. Ireland had the worst level of emissions at 70% above its NEC, while Bulgaria had the best at 58% below its NEC. Only 6 EU member states exceeded their 2010 national emission ceiling in 2017 for non-methane volatile organic compounds. Ireland had the highest level of emissions among EU member states in 2017 relative to its 2010 NEC at 106%, whilst Malta had the lowest emissions at 77%. Greenhouse gas emissions. In 2017, Ireland's greenhouse gas emissions were 60.7 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. This was a reduction compared with the peak average annual emissions of 68.8 million tonnes in 2000-2004, but was 7.9% higher than the 1990 to 1994 average of 56.3 million tonnes. EU greenhouse gas emissions per capita. In 2017, Ireland had the third highest emissions of greenhouse gases per capita in the EU at 13.3 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent per capita. Ireland's emissions were 51% higher than the EU 28 average of 8.8 tonnes. Estonia and Luxembourg had the highest level of CO2 emissions per capita in 2017 at 16 and 20.2 tonnes respectively. Sweden had the lowest rate of emissions in 2017 at 5.5 tonnes per capita. Ireland greenhouse gas emissions by sector. Agriculture was the sector with the largest greenhouse gas emissions in Ireland over the 1990 to 2017 period, with 33% of the total in 2017. So I found that one actually quite interesting myself. So Ireland urban wastewater treatment. Another indicator here would be Ireland river water quality, EU forest cover, EU organic agricultural land, electricity generation from renewable sources, and just some conclusions here. I'll focus on these. The environmental indicator report shows Ireland's environmental performance on a wide range of indicators. Environmental performance is good or improving for a number of indicators, including urban wastewater treatment, the share of renewable energy in electricity generation, and the collection of packaging and electro waste. However, performance is still poor for indicators such as air pollutants, greenhouse gas emissions, river water quality, forest cover, and organic agriculture. So I'll just move on quite swiftly and just cover the Sustainable Development Goals. So Sustainable Development Goals are the blueprint to achieve a better and sustainable future for all. They address the global challenges we face, including those related to poverty, inequality, climate change, environmental degradation, peace and justice. The 17 goals are all interconnected in order to leave no one behind, and it's important that we achieve them all by 2013. So this is just a graph here of the UN SDG indicators and showing the amount of data that we've sourced and the amount of data that we've yet to source. So CSO has a role in sourcing, managing and presenting the data in relating to the 17 indicators. There's also an SDG platform that can be accessed at the above link here, and there's a series of spatial data sets relating to the SDGs. And CSO has governance over the SDG data. CSO has also established a Ireland data governance team and also established a national UN SDG indicators data governance board. Just some imagery here of the data that is available on GeoHive. I actually have a background myself in mapping, so I'm quite a fan of the maps that we can see here, story maps. I think it's quite interesting to see the data in your own region as well. Just to move on, this is a infograph. This is actually my last slide here. So this is an infograph from the Regional SDGs in Ireland 2017, released in early 2019, and this is available on the CSO website. So areas covered include poverty, employment, education, central heating, broadband, medical cards and penalty points. And my colleague in the SDG division has also actually notified me that the SDG division will be publishing a report on Ireland's data for the UN SDG Goal 3, Health and Wellbeing, next week on the 9th of June 2020. And this will include a special focus on COVID-19 for the SDG target 3.3 communicable diseases. So that's all for myself. Apologies for running over on time there, folks.
Okay, thank you very much, Sinead. We could listen to that all day, and there's so much material there that is of relevance to us here in Ireland. I think it would be fair to say that, you know, our economic progress as a country has not been matched by our environmental progress as a country, and your graphs really show that very well. I think also it would be fair to say that in Ireland, as in many countries, we're good at making plans and good at setting targets, but not very good at implementing them. And one of the key things that actually drives implementation is if the decision makers, if the public servants have to comply with a particular legal requirement. And that's why I'm so interested in hearing what Glyn has to say now, because Wales has actually gone down that road of having a law established in terms of economic, of well-being in general, with indicators which are supervised by the Auditor General, supervised by the Commissioner for Future Generations, a very interesting concept which we might learn a little about. So all being well, and fingers crossed, I'll try and pass you over to Glyn now to talk a little about the Welsh experience. Can we go to Glyn?
Yeah,
great.
Thank you very much.
So far, so good.
Hear me? Yes. You can share your screen for me? This is just to thank you all for the opportunity to talk today and to give the Welsh perspective. So I thought I'd put some beautiful photos of Wales as a bit of an advert, so that when this is all over, you'll be able to come and visit us. Just to highlight that Wales is a beautiful country with countryside, mountains, coastlines, heritage, and there should be a picture of a vibrant Cardiff appearing now. But I think bringing those pictures over just to highlight, obviously, that our challenge is to think about, well, how can we get the Wales we want? How can we make sure the future generations have the vibrancy of economic growth alongside the resilience of that natural environment, and how do we balance all that together to give the Wales the future generations want and need. Caroline, if you go to the next slide now, thanks, John. As I said in my preamble, I'm going to talk a bit about the Wellbeing Future Generations Act and our goals, national indicators and so on. So if you could flick through to the next slide, please, John. So in Wales, we have a strong history of adopting sustainable development principles. So just to be clear, each of the countries within the United Kingdom have their own democratically elected parliaments. In Wales, we've had the National Assembly for Wales, and it's now called the Senedd since March, which can pass laws in a range of areas. And since devolution in 1998, one of the core principles of the Welsh Government has been about sustainable development, and in 1998 we were one of the first countries to make sustainable development a legal obligation, and our composition of the Assembly required Welsh ministers to develop and promote a sustainable development scheme. And we put dedicated legal and policy resource to develop legislation which was intended to enable public services to tackle those really difficult societal problems and to mobilise civil society. So from the very early start of the Assembly, this was our core principle. Moving on then to 2012, there was a Sustainable Development White Paper, which was supported then by a national conversation led by, at the time, our non-statutory Sustainable Development Commissioner, who started a national conversation about the Wales we want by 2050, following on from the United Nations work on the future we want, which is from 2012. And this made it clear there was a need to think differently and act collectively and build a consensus around shared goals for the country, the goals that are most important to us, for our children and our grandchildren. This led to the Wellbeing Future Generations Act in 2015, and I'll talk a bit now about the building blocks of that act. As I mentioned earlier, continued commitment to this since 2015. We've now joined the Wellbeing Economy Government Network with Scotland, Iceland and New Zealand, and very recently, even within the pandemic, there was a virtual policy lab sharing thoughts on wellbeing economics in the context of COVID-19. So these are the building blocks to the Wellbeing Act. So the overarching framework for our thinking has always been the Sustainable Development Goals, which were actually being developed in parallel with our own wellbeing goals. So the Act defines 7 wellbeing goals for Wales. These are the goals that we want to achieve through this legislation, and I'm going to talk about a bit more about those on the next slide. But the Act is quite clear that we have to measure how we're doing against those goals, and puts onto the statute book the requirement for Welsh ministers to deliver a set of national indicators and national milestones, and I will talk more about those later. But importantly as well, it set out a series of duties for public bodies to make this happen. So it clarified sustainable development as the central organising principle, but also put on duties for those public bodies to set out plans and assessments on how they would set about achieving those goals. 44 public bodies are in scope of the Act. That includes local government, health boards and non-departmental public bodies. And those bodies come together in 20, I think, public service boards, which are collaborations across those boards, but they are statutory function who are intended to set our wellbeing plans for Wales. Business and third sector are not actively named in the Act, but they are involved. The statutory guidance for public sector encourages bodies to involve and work across those sectors as well. The Act requires 5 ways of working across all those public bodies. It requires us to integrate the way we work together, to integrate the public services across sector. It requires the public bodies to focus on prevention, to make sure the policy choices they're making will prevent future problems for future generations. It promotes collaboration, the need for public bodies to work together and collaborate for achieving those goals. That every decision has to think about the long-term implications and the implications of future generations, and also involvement. How do we involve the public and citizens in our decision making? And those are 5 statutory ways of working that the public bodies have to comply with. And then there is a set of accountability. So John mentioned the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales. The Future Generations Commissioner's role is to be the guardian of future generations, to help public bodies and help those who make policy in Wales to think about the long-term impact their decisions have, and also to scrutinise the decisions we make. And there's also accountability from the auditors, from the Welsh Parliament, and also citizens who also obviously can hold us to account through elections and other means. If you go on to the next slide, please, John. This describes the 7 wellbeing goals for Wales. These are actually defined within the legislation, so these words are set down within legislation, and these are the goals we're all trying to achieve collectively for Wales, and therefore these are what we're trying to measure, and that's what I'll come on to now. But you will see within these words how integrated these goals are. They're not supposed to be standing alone, they're supposed to be an integrated set of outcomes that we want to achieve. So under prosperity, it talks about the low carbon society, recognising the limit of the global environment. It doesn't just talk about economic growth as a thing in itself. Resilience talks about maintaining the natural environment, but also supporting social, economic and ecological resilience. So the very nature of these are supposed to be an integrated set of goals that work collectively. If we go on to the next slide, please, John. As I said, within there was a requirement for national indicators. These are the words of the Act, that ministers must set national indicators that are measured quantitatively over a period of time. And these indicators are supposed to assess whether we are making progress towards achieving the wellbeing goals. So what I'll do now is talk a little bit about how we went about doing that. If we go on to the next slide, please, John. So back in 2015, 2015, we started on a conversation around the national indicators and what we should measure. This was a really successful consultation in terms of the kind of consultations we usually do on statistical work. With loads of engagement, we went around Wales and did many events, but also obviously a lot of people wrote in. But we wanted to be quite clear in our criteria, because obviously when you go around setting a national indicator framework, there is always a clamour to include everything. And we were very focused on a limited number of indicators. We were talking about a maximum of 40 indicators that we wanted to have. We wanted to measure outcomes for people of Wales, the outcomes for citizens, the outcomes for the people of Wales, and not use these as performance measures for local authorities. We were coming on the back of a history of a plethora of performance measures for local government, and we wanted to bring local government with us and see these as shared indicators and shared outcomes, and not things that they were going to be hit over the head with. We wanted the indicators to be coherent and fit together to help measure those 7 goals. We wanted the indicators to resonate to the public so that they could understand what we were trying to measure. I would say that's probably the one that we've maybe not quite achieved, because some of the indicators are necessarily technical in nature. We also wanted them to be indicators where we could achieve significant progress over the long term. We were thinking of these as indicators for 20, 30 years, not just the next 2 or 3 years. Challenges were around the balance between subjective and objective measures. We really wanted to make sure that we were including people's own subjective feelings about well-being and not just objective measures. So, for example, We didn't use administrative data on recorded crime, but we did use people's own perception of feeling safe, and there are other decisions we had to make along those lines. And as I've mentioned, desire to be integrated, but also involvement and collaboration and bringing people with us on this journey. So if you go to the next slide, please, John. This is just sort of the cover of our consultation document. Went really well. The Future Generations Commissioner has just been appointed at that time, and she gave us really valuable input into the thinking on this. It was literally the first thing that came across her desk when she was appointed, and she set out very quickly a series of workshops to get a load of input in, and she worked with another organisation to give her views on what the national indicators would be. And we genuinely listened, we made changes, so what we talked about 40, we ended up with 46, and that's because we genuinely changed things as a result of that consultation to make sure that we were measuring what people wanted us to measure. And this is the output. So if you go on the next slide, please, John. There's a list here of the 46, there's 16 here and 30 on the next slide. So we didn't go down the road to a single index, which other speakers have spoken about. And we felt that we wanted to not focus on a single number. We wanted public bodies to think about the contribution that they were making towards those goals as a collective, and in each different sector to think about how they were contributing to each of the goals. So we've used this kind of visualization where we're mapping the indicators against the goals to be clear that the National Health Service should not just see goal 3 as their goal, because everything the NHS does also contributes to everything else. Prosperity, people are healthier, they're more likely to be in work. And a whole load of other areas where things cross-fertilise. So we know that more educated people are likely to be healthier. It's going to reduce inequalities, it's going to help the Welsh language, and it's also going to help future prosperity. So we've continuously used this presentation to try and demonstrate to public bodies that they are contributing to all the outcomes, all the goals. If you can move on to the next slide, please, John. This indicates where we brought in some of the subjective measures. So 14 of our indicators are from our national survey for Wales, which is a large-scale household survey of individuals, which we use to measure satisfaction of people with public services, but also their subjective well-being. And as we'll see on the next slide, this covers things such as whether people feel safe, whether they feel belonging to their local area, what their feeling is on community cohesion, and so on. And that I don't think we can measure wellbeing outcomes without having those subjective measures and the ability to talk directly to citizens on this. We've also recently had a small review of the indicators, and we're going to be expanding some of our indicators around fair work, the equality pay gaps, and we're thinking about, and we're going to introduce a new measure of globally responsible, which is the 7th goal, in terms of how people are contributing globally. So some of these indicators on the left-hand side cover those subjective measures that I spoke about, and you'll see on the right some of the environmental and resilient measures there. Thank you very much. So on the next slide then, just talk a little bit about the outputs and how we presented it. So we wrapped all this together, as well as a statutory requirement for the national indicators. There was also a statutory requirement for a report against the indicators on an annual basis. Ministers agreed very early on that should be a statistical report, that it should be produced under our independent code of practice, to be clear that it was a report of the Chief Statistician and not a political report. So that falls firmly under my banner now. So we've produced this wellbeing report 3 times now. We're trying to tell the story of how we are doing against those goals. It's not a report on 46 national indicators. It's a report on whether we are becoming healthier as a nation, whether we're becoming more equal, whether we are becoming more resilient. And to do that, we report on the national indicators, but also other relevant data. And this was a strong theme of the consultation, that people felt there were other measures we needed to think about, but we didn't think they necessarily made for good national indicators. And crime data is one example of those. Because of the issues in measurement, we don't think it's a good national indicator, but if the level of sexual violence or violent assault goes up, that's a really important thing to measure, because it's indicating something, and we will bring all of that together into a wellbeing report to tell the story. We also pulled together a tool linking our national indicators to the Sustainable Development Goals, as well. We also used a dashboard and presented the 46 national indicators. Actually, if you just go on to the next slide, please, John. These are the annual wellbeing reports. There will be a link at the end. So on the left-hand side is the main report, and then in 2018 we produced a specific report focusing on those indicators around children's wellbeing. And in the goodness of time, we hope to do more kind of specific reports about particular aspects. If you could carry on to the next slide, please, John. And these are the sort of dashboard approach we're taking. So every national indicator has a page like this, an interactive page where you can drill down into the data and understand what the trends are for the indicators. And as the previous speaker said, we want these to be kept in real time because of the very point made, the annual report will very often be out of date. I suspect I'm running out of time, so I'm going to canter through. We've gone to the next slide, please, John. So we used the same mapping, this looked familiar from the previous slide, to think about how our national indicators showed our contribution in Wales to the Sustainable Development Goals. So I'm only showing the first 12 here, but we have them, it's for all 46. We did find actually that we were covering most of the 17 goals within our national indicators. And last year, the UK government undertook a voluntary review of our progress against the Sustainable Development Goals in the UK. We also issued a supplementary report about Wales and the SDGs, and our report drew heavily on the contribution we as statisticians have given through the national indicators and the Wellbeing of Wales report. We have used this also to identify gaps, so I think we're lacking in goal 16, and I would like us to have a national indicator on justice and equal access to justice in the future, and it's also helped us think through whether we are covering the right areas in our national indicators. On to the next slide, please, John. This is a massive topic in itself. I could do a whole hour on national milestones. This work is not as well advanced as anything else for various reasons, but the national milestones are a way of telling the country where we want to get to. That they will show by 2050 where we want to be. We started consulting on this last year. Things have slowed down because of the pandemic and so on. There are some obvious ones where we think we'll make natural national milestones. We have a national target for 1 million Welsh speakers by 2050. That would be a national milestone. For some others, it'll be much harder. How do you set a national milestone for biodiversity, for example? How do you set a national milestone for loneliness? We know we're not going to have milestones for every single national indicator, but that's really important work that I'm sure we'll be asked to proceed with quite quickly in the next few months. And just some concluding thoughts now, if you could go on to the next slide, please, John. So some positive thoughts. So I think the engagement and involvement in developing the public and public bodies and indicators was critical. This brought public bodies with us. They didn't see these as measures to hit them over the head with. They saw them as a collective set of indicators that we wanted to measure. As I said, I've got this platform around a State of the Nation report now. Whilst my department are continuously publishing statistics, we've never once pulled it together to tell the people of Wales how we are doing as a nation, and I think that's an incredibly powerful tool for us to have as statisticians, to tell the nation that life expectancy has stalled, to talk about inequalities in a rounded sense, and also obviously to talk about where things are going well. The national indicators do have a status. There are organisations who feel very strongly that there should be a national indicator for their subject area because they feel if it isn't a national indicator that there will be less priority put to it. That's not necessarily the case. It demonstrates that the national wellbeing indicators are seen as an important set of indicators. But in addition, policy documents are now being written with the idea of how they contribute to the wellbeing goals and how they the measurement framework for those policy documents being framed by the national wellbeing indicators. We've seen this on employability, fair work and on gender equality, where national indicators are seen as an important way of tracking progress on those areas. And the final slide, please, John. My first concluding thought was about whether indicators are truly helping us make those difficult choices. Are they really helping us get to the bottom of what policy choice we should make? How are they being used by policymakers to make those choices? And you really need to get underneath the indicators to help that. And we've tried to put out a series of materials to look at the factors that are important in making changes in those indicators through regression analysis and so on. So, you know, that's a truly difficult challenge for anybody involved in this agenda. How do we make the story heard? I think there is a comms issue around how we communicate the annual wellbeing report to make sure people are hearing and thinking about the policy implications of those trends. Inequalities is a constant issue for us in Wales, both in terms of the fact we have stark inequalities, but also the fact that we have difficulty measuring it because generally the groups are small that we want to look at, and data issues come in there in terms of sample size of surveys and so on. So that's a constant challenge that we're trying to tackle and do better on. Finally, I'll talk about the impact of the pandemic. So the positive impact of the pandemic in terms of the Future Generations Act is it will help public sector bodies reset and think differently for the future. We know there is no normal to go back to. It is a new normal, and we need to transform the way we're doing things in future. And I think we are well set in Wales around the Future Generations Act to drive that. In terms of measurement, it comes to me about whether we are the 46 indicators we've set going to tell us about the impact of the pandemic. If they don't, then what else should we be measuring? For example, we're not measuring anything about people's concerns over safety of going on public transport. We're not measuring people's feelings about their own personal safety in terms of health, and we're not measuring home working or digital inclusion within the national indicators. We do have measures of those, but we haven't them as national indicators. But also real time. If I'm going to do an annual wellbeing report in September, is it good enough to be talking about last year's data when we've just seen a fundamental shift in people's well-being over the last few months, and the expectations of people to have real-time data now is bigger than it ever has been. So I think there's lots to think about, and I shall conclude it there, and my contact details are on the next slide, as well as a link to further resources. Thank you very much for steering me through that, John.
Three things I took from that. First of all, integration. The importance of integration. Secondly, the importance of accountability. And thirdly, the example you give of joined up thinking, which I think is really good. And I think that's something we should bear in mind. I'm going to pass you back to Caroline now for a brief break to give you a chance to gather your thoughts together, and also a chance to think up questions. We've got lots and lots of questions. We won't get through half of them or even a quarter of them. But if you have a question, put it in the question and answer box, and we'll try and group them and get to them in a couple of minutes' time. But I'll hand you back to Caroline just now. Welcome back, everybody. That was a tour de force for three papers, which we could really have listened to for almost an hour each because there was so much material in them. But they have generated an enormous number of really good questions and really searching questions. So what I propose now is we've tried to group some of them together, and we'll try and address them maybe by individual members of the panel to begin with, and then towards the end we'll try and sum up and ask the question, where do we go from here? But let me start with the first question, which is a kind of a general one which came out, and it's the difficulty of actually representing humanity in statistics. It's of course the big problem of any kind of well-being index, and one of the key things that was coming out here was how do we represent, for example, the role of public investment in public goods. This was particularly, I think, relevant for Benjamin, because he's looking at very much at monetization. But other intangibles, Benjamin, that you think might be lost along the way by this approach in terms of the role of public versus private investment, public being more directed towards social rather than straightforward short-term economic gains. Maybe you could have a crack at thinking about that one for us.
Well, you mentioned, in my perspective, two different things. At first, the first question was about how quantifying well-being overall is a good thing is, and that's of course a very valid objection to our approach in specific, because we do it with monetization, which is the next step there. So Well, what I would answer to that is that I think there are many aspects of life that are very important to us that we cannot put into numbers. And where maybe there are other ways we have to deal with them, like, for example, by laws or by other things like that. But I also think that there are many aspects where you have to weigh up between different legitimate concerns. And for that, you need some kind of comparable information. And I think numbers are one of the options on the table which are good suited to do that. I do not see how we can live in such a complex world like we live in today without at least some of the aspects which are important in our daily life are put into numbers. And if we don't put them into numbers, then there's the real danger that these issues won't be considered at all. So I think, of course, there's a very, very valid objection, but we have to, well, at least in some fields, we have to measure them and try to put them into numbers to make the decision-making progress work. The other thing with the public investment in public goods, I think that was a really specific question concerning the NWI as I looked at it. And it's right, public expenditure is part of the NWI, but until now just to a limited extent. That's one of the components where we are looking right now. It's only true for education and health, and we are looking right now to improve the methodology to also include other public expenditures which are relevant for national and personal welfare. As it is right now, NWI only includes part of the public expenditures which are relevant to welfare, but we're trying to improve that.
Okay, thank you very much, Benjamin. A second question really is directed towards Glyn, but your approach in Wales was a dashboard-based approach, whereas Benjamin was a single composite index-based approach. I'm wondering what you think are the relative merits and demerits of each, and why you opted for a dashboard approach.
Yeah, I don't mean to say one method is better than the other, but I think we did have, I think, conversations about indices and so on, but from our point of view, we generally wanted to look at this as a set of indicators that everybody could see how they contribute to, and what were the drivers behind well-being in terms of what contribution they could make to the goals. We'd spent the previous 2 years, as it happened, before we got into the well-being indicators in a way, to try and debunk the idea that even within an economic context, that GDP was the be-all and end-all. There was a lot of pressure for the idea of the need for a quarterly GDP in Wales, which we now have. But myself and the chief economist put across the view that you needed to look at a basket of indicators, even in terms of the economy. You needed to look at wealth, the labour market, and poverty, as well as GDP. So it would have been a little bit then, I suppose, hypocritical for us to then put well-being in terms of one indicator, and we felt that basket approach was really important to help people understand the wider contribution they could make. I suppose I'd just pick up one aspect on the previous question as well as part of this, is what we're seeing very much is public bodies want to know how they can demonstrate their impact, and demonstrating their impact through the national indicators. And I think that is a challenge for them without an easy metric to say we are making X% impact on overall well-being. So it does come with its challenges to not have a single figure. But that was our approach to it.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for that. part of the differences between the single composite index and the if you like, the wide dashboard approach is that the dashboard approach maybe gives you a little better handle on some aspects. And I'm thinking in particular of things like biodiversity, which Glyn, you mentioned as something very difficult to bring into any kind of index of well-being. But people obviously increasingly, even over the past 3 months, tend to now be newfound believers in the role of biodiversity from a mental health point of view, from a well-being point of view as well. Is there any way you think you can incorporate these kind of intangible variables into a well-being index, either as composite or as a dashboard approach? And let's go back to Glyn then, because I think he mentioned specifically biodiversity as a problem area for Wales. Any comments there, Glyn, you'd like to add?
Yeah, we do have biodiversity in our set of national indicators, but it does come with that issue, that problem, because it's an incredibly difficult measurement framework underpinning biodiversity, and you're talking about different habitats and how they interact with each other. So what is the one measure, I think, is the big challenge that people who are far cleverer than me on these kind of topics are actively thinking about. And then if you turn that into, as I said, a national milestone, what are you trying to achieve in 20 years' time? You also fall foul of the level of detail. So another metric that we have within our indicator is the percentage of people who are following the 5 healthy lifestyle behaviours. So they don't smoke, they don't drink, they eat healthily, they exercise, and they have a good BMI. So we wrap those together in one indicator because we wanted to focus on a small number of indicators. But actually the push on us is we really need to understand the separate composition of those things, because in a sense they all have slightly different weight, and if 90% of the population are smoking but everybody's eating healthily, that's still a massive impact on public health. So I would just see that problem compounded by having one index figure.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me move on then to Sinead. I don't know, are you there, Sinead, at this stage? No?
Sorry, I'm here. I think it just
yes,
might be
great.
a slight strain on my Wi-Fi or something. I'm not too sure. Apologies, there's a couple of us.
Sinead, the CSO recently published a list of environmentally damaging activities in Ireland, and it relates in a way to one of the questions we're getting, which is how do you incorporate subsidies into damaging activities which may well then not be apparent in a well-being index? For example, fossil fuel subsidies. Is there any way of incorporating those kinds of hidden dimensions into the well-being output, which would, of course, in Benjamin's case, be simply quantified as fuel consumption? Yes, we can.
John, I'm afraid my own background, it's actually not an environment. So what I'll actually do, if you don't mind, I might pass that question on to my colleague Raymond, who would be responsible for putting together the environmental indicators report, and I might come back to you with an answer for that question if that will be okay at a later date.
That's fine. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
Benjamin, would you have any comment on that, or would it be something you'd be worried about?
I don't think, well, in the NWI we would incorporate the effects of this fossil fuel subsidies, not the fossil fuel subsidies itself. So the problem would be that the greenhouse gas emissions would be bigger than they would be if the fossil fuel subsidies wouldn't be there, and not the fossil fuel subsidies itself would be the problem. So that's the different approach. We have in Germany also a report which focuses on environmental harmful subsidies, but I think we won't be able to incorporate them directly in the NWI, a measure like that. But you have to have other information systems as well, and methods to regulate the politics and government.
Yes, one of the other issues that's coming up, and it perhaps relates also to the German experience, is the possibility of going down the scale regionally to community and local level for well-being indices. Now, some parts of Ireland have sort of rough indicators, if you like, for 5 or 6 domains, but what scope do you see for extending well-being indices down where they can be incorporated into, for example, local planning plans, local development plans, and so on?
I think for the really local level, NWI won't be the right instrument. It's just for one thing, the data is just not available at this level, and on the other side, the problems which it addresses can't be regulated at the local level. So I think for the local level, other indicator sets or other indices has had to be developed. For this, I have to say the NWI is just not the right instrument, because it has fields in it that there's no data for the local level at one side, and the problems cannot be solved at the local level, like income inequality, for example. It's not a thing that the local level can address. That's the national level who has to address that.
Okay, that kind of suggests to me that we need to move to more of a dashboard for the local level. And maybe I could ask Glyn what the possibilities are, for example, segregating South Wales from North Wales in terms of his dashboard.
This is a very relevant question for us. It was something we thought quite hard about when we were developing the original set, because we could quite easily have used as one of our criteria that the indicators were measurable locally, because we knew there would be a high demand for that, because the Act was putting in place this strong requirement for local wellbeing assessments, and also that public service boards locally had to give regard to the national indicators. But we didn't use it as a criteria because we felt we would then be missing out on things that we simply can't measure locally very well, and we'd be hostages to fortune, in a sense that we would be limiting our national wellbeing outcomes. But what we have done is made available as much as possible the indicators that we can do by the local authority. I can't remember the figure in my head, but it's certainly more than half. Even maybe 3/4 of the data is available at local authority level. We make that available to them, and we encourage them to give regard to the national indicators within their planning, but also obviously to give regard to local intelligence as well, and not to see the national indicators as the only game in town for their future planning. That they have to. It is in legislation that their assessments of local wellbeing must refer to the national indicators, but we also promote them to use a wide range of other evidence which is supportive of their local area.
Yeah, fascinating. Okay, well, I mean, it's almost impossible to go through all the many questions we've had at this stage. I mean, we could spend all afternoon discussing them, and we've tried to group them. But what I would like to move on to for the final stage of our discussion now is more or less, where do we go from here? Because we've heard 3 very fascinating papers on 3 slightly different approaches to quantifying, to even estimating changes in the past and in the future for well-being. We've seen, for example, that tantalising graph from Benjamin of how Ireland fared during the Celtic Tiger, during the recession, and now during the recovery. And we've seen the divergences that occur, which hint to me at things like social spending being a role, which hint to me at things like environmental protection playing a role, which hint to me that maybe we can move beyond the economic paradigm a little more effectively in the future than we have in the past. So I'd like to just throw the question open to our panel in the sense. And the first question is really, how can we make sure that GDP is binned to some extent in the future, but that we can move beyond GDP in the future to incorporate in a more formal way some of these exciting ideas that we've heard this morning, and get them embedded in the political psyche and embedded in the institutional psyche of our respective countries. So maybe as the person who is perhaps gone a little further in terms of the legalities of all of this, I'd throw it open to Glyn to begin with and give us some advice on his experience as to how to progress beyond GDP in a more formal way.
I was worried you were going to come to me first.
My first victim.
I mean, the key to a lot of this is strong leadership, and having a government that genuinely believes in the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act, and that this is the way we need to do things in Wales, and that we need to involve people. We need to think about the long term, and as with any process of change, you need that leadership and commitment to the top, and one that consistently uses those messages. Having it in law clearly helps. It does obviously set in motion a series of things which mean that people have to start thinking differently, have to start thinking beyond purely economic growth. But I think it's fair to say that having it in law doesn't necessarily achieve this, because you can easily write a report and not necessarily do things differently. So I think it is a hearts and minds thing. People need to be able. The public bodies need to have that strong leadership and commitment to genuinely do things differently. We're still on a journey, I think it's fair to say. I know it's a cliche. The Act was in place in 2015, so we're only now finishing the first set of products of the Act. So we had local wellbeing assessments, local wellbeing reports, the national indicators, the first reports from the Future Generations Commissioner looking back at the 5 years. All of that is a platform where we've done fantastically to move things along. There's some really great case studies across Wales on how people have started to think differently, but also there are areas where we could do more. We could do more in terms of the next phase of local wellbeing plans, the next phase of local wellbeing assessments. I'm sure they'll be very different. Even without the pandemic, I'm sure they would have been very different to the first set. So you need to be in it for the long haul.
Okay, thank you. Benjamin, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think Glyn mentioned the government or the decision level. I would also say that the public debate about it is really important. Because I think only if we have an informed public who is demanding or, well, thinking about and demanding a well-being or alternative welfare measurement, there will be, on the one hand, enough political pressure to really implement it in a meaningful way, and on the other hand, well, a sufficiently high level of acceptance for this measurement in the public to really for what is needed to make it really effective then. So I think we also need to have this public discussion about these measurements and these possibilities of measurement. And I think we really have, well, in my opinion, in the last years, there was a growing public awareness to this topic. It has phases, it goes up and down, but overall, I think it's growing because people think more about these issues. And on the other hand, we have more tools at our disposal how we can measure things because of digitization. So overall, I think we have good opportunities to go forward from here.
Yes, that's a very important point, and I want to see if I can maybe get Sinead's view on it as well, because in a sense today we're talking to 150 people who are all committed and are very much in agreement with what we're doing, I suspect. But to progress further, we need to bring society with us. We need to bring people along the road with us, as you emphasise, as both of you emphasised. And I'm wondering, Sinead, do you have any views on what we should be doing to try and do that, to bring the people with us? Because without acceptance and without public support, we really flounder a bit, don't we?
John, I'm afraid actually as CSO, it's an independent organisation, so I just won't be able to comment on this section, but I hope that's okay.
Okay, all right. So I think, the message is quite clear, though, that, the public authorities need guidance, and they need direction, which comes ultimately from the public themselves, society themselves, through the medium of their legislators and of their decision makers. So yeah, I think that's an important one. Could we maybe ask you, Sinead, how likely then is it that we can get some kind of more sophisticated well-being index established in Ireland in the near future? Do you think that's a feasible ambition for us to get out of today's event?
CSO is to actually keep the wellbeing dashboard going, which actually looks at, I suppose, individual indicators as opposed to creating an index. And the reason for this is, I suppose it's quite difficult to put various weights on indicators. As an independent organisation, we like to keep, I suppose, to view all indicators as being equal rather than to put various weights on various indicators to create the index. So the hope for the CSO would be to keep the dashboard going and to view each of the indicators as individual, I suppose, components of wellbeing.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think we're nearly coming to an end here, and before I pass you over to James to sum up, I suppose the question that might be lingering in our minds at the end of this morning and the afternoon is, how can Ireland perhaps join that wellbeing alliance that we've heard about with Scotland, Iceland, New Zealand, Wales, even Northern Ireland? I mean, there must be opportunities for us to progress along that road, which we should try and exploit. And I think that will be an alliance that we can learn from in Ireland, because we don't need to make the mistakes perhaps that have been made along the way by other countries, but we can learn from the best practices that we've heard this morning and this afternoon from Wales and from Germany and from Ireland as well. So I think there are certain positive things we can take out of today, and that is one of them, that we mustn't sit on our hands on this topic and allow the economists to shape our future. We must actually get up and alert society to the fact that their well-being and that of future generations will depend on us moving away from a very strictly economically driven paradigm in terms of the way society evolves towards a more sustainable well-being one. It may not be the SDGs necessarily. There is some controversy about some of them, as we know, but it certainly should be towards a more defined and a more, I suppose, acceptable to society version of how our future generations go. And I'm really interested in what Glyn said about the Commissioner for Future Generations, because we are talking today about intergenerational equity, which is a key for all of these themes that we've discussed today. And that might be something that maybe we should get going on in Ireland in terms of our programme for government if and when it emerges in the near future. But I'm going to thank you for your participation, but I'm going to pass you over to James O'Donovan from the Cork Environmental Forum to finalise events this morning and this afternoon. Thank you.
So I would like to thank very much our three participants, Glyn Jones, Benjamin Held and Sinead Bracken, for sharing their insights with us, and also to John Sweeney for moderating the webinar and Caroline for hosting it. On World Environment Day, we are experiencing global events that are the consequences of human action encroaching on ecosystems and other species, air pollution and inequality, and sometimes they're unpredictable events. We know the policy for government is being drawn up now, and the parties have stated that their overriding focus is to improve the well-being of the Irish people and society, and they've made a commitment that to assess the performance of a new government, they will look beyond economic indicators, creating new, credible quality of life measures of individual and societal well-being and progress. The Cork Environmental Forum and the Foundation for Economic Sustainability set up this webinar to try and give you a taste of the very important social and economic movement that has the potential to shift away from a growth economy towards a well-being economy. So this approach has already put down roots in a number of countries where health, well-being and a future generation's perspective are being put at the heart of government decisions. And this creates a supportive context for policy decisions that can be more intelligent over the long term. So we've seen, you know, in New Zealand, the wellbeing budget has come out. Iceland have also released policies, and they're putting more emphasis on funding for mental health, more emphasis on funding for things like childcare, for paternal leave. So these quality of life things enhance the quality of life very much. Scotland also have done a lot of work on this, and I would highly recommend Nicola Sturgeon's TED Talk on the work that they're doing in Scotland. So CEF and Feasta have produced an online wellbeing information resource, and we'll be updating those in the coming weeks with some of the very good feedback and suggestions we've had. We've seen some wellbeing work being done with the PPN network in Ireland now, which looks very promising. Each of the countries in that resource and that have appeared today, they have established wellbeing departments, and they can provide additional support and expertise on their experience in legislation, on public participation, and on integrating wellbeing into policy and budgeting decisions. You can keep up to date with the work of CEF and Feasta on our websites and through social media. We are planning to host future events, including further explorations of wellbeing and an event on the greening of finance, and we'll email out details about these events. So thanks very much and have a great weekend. Caroline, do you want to, anything additional you want to add, or?
Thanks a lot, James, and just a big thank you once again to everybody. Originally, this was going to be a brick and mortar event, and it's morphed into a webinar, and I'm really happy that it's happened after all. And many thanks also to John for his hard work moderating as well. Much appreciated. Thank you all very much, and goodbye.